The garrison at Hethysvor was not supposed to have a garden. Staff Sergeant Callum Reed had built it anyway, in the narrow strip of courtyard between the eastern barracks wall and the old supply annex. A patch of ground that the base architect had clearly intended as a fire lane, and which no one had used as anything since the human contingent arrived 14 months ago. He'd started with a single planter box salvaged from a decommissioned equipment crate, filled it with a soil mix the quartermaster had declared surplus, and grown something that might charitably be called herbs and might more honestly be called the things that didn't die. From there it had expanded. 3 more boxes, a trellis of bent rebar and salvaged wire, a small patch of ground-level beds where he transplanted what the local Hethori gardeners called vel moss, a soft, blue-gray ground cover that smelled faintly of something between rain and iron, and seemed to like the morning light that fell through the gap between the walls. His commanding officer, Captain Nesbitt, had looked at it once, frowned, and said nothing, which from Nesbitt was the same as approval. The garden was not a secret. Half the garrison knew about it. They walked past it on the way to the drill yard. They sometimes sat on the low wall at the edge of it when the afternoon was warm enough and the duty roster allowed a pause. But it was, in a quiet way, understood to be Reed's, the way certain spaces in shared postings always belonged to whoever had made something of them. He was in it on the morning everything changed, on his knees beside the vel moss beds with a short-handled trowel, and a running mental list of what needed doing before the weekly perimeter check at 1400. The soil near the eastern wall had dried too much. The angle of the sun in high season pulled moisture out of it faster than he'd accounted for when he'd built the beds there. He was thinking about whether to move the crate or build a shade structure, and he was not paying attention to anything beyond the immediate problem of the soil, which was why he didn't hear the sound until it was already quite close. A sound like a very small sneeze, followed by something that was almost but not quite silence, a held breath, or the careful stillness of something that had decided not to move. Reed sat back on his heels and looked around. The annex wall had a gap in it, low down, a section of stone where a corner had crumbled inward at some point before the human garrison arrived, leaving a rough opening perhaps 60 centimeters wide and 40 tall. The gap was blocked from outside by a section of old wooden paneling that the garrison had propped there to reduce the wind. He had noticed it when he was first building the beds. He had made a note to report it to the facility's quartermaster, and had then become absorbed in the problem of drainage and forgotten. The paneling was still there, still propped, and now it was very slightly not where it had been, shifted a degree or two, as if someone had leaned against it from the outside. Or come through it. He turned fully and looked at the base of the annex wall, where the vel moss beds grew thickest. A child was sitting in the middle of them. She was very small, perhaps 4 or 5 by human reckoning, and she was Hethori, which meant she had the faint luminescent quality of her people's skin, a soft pale gold that caught light differently than human skin did, as if it remembered light it had stored from earlier in the day. Her hair was a deep, vivid copper, braided into dozens of small plaits that were held at their ends by something that had been very tidy and was now considerably less so, several braids having come loose in what he suspected was the process of squeezing through the gap in the annex wall. Her eyes, when she looked up at him, were a startling shade of amber-orange, and very, very wide. She had vel moss on both hands, her knees, and a patch of her left cheek. She was staring at him with the particular expression of a child who has been caught, and is trying to determine whether the person who has caught her is the kind who shouts. Reed set down his trowel very carefully. "Hello," he said. The child did not answer. She looked from his face to the trowel to the vel moss beds and back to his face. "I'm Callum," he said. He pointed at himself. "Cal." This she processed for a moment, then carefully, Sevri. Her accent was the soft, rounded sound of the northern Hethori dialect, where the consonants folded slightly inward. His Hethori was functional but not graceful. He'd learned it from a language pack and had been correcting the accent for 14 months with only partial success. "Sevri," he repeated, and she gave a small, satisfied nod as if he'd passed a test. "Your garden," she said. It wasn't a question. She looked at the Velmoss around her with an expression that was halfway between guilt and delight. "My garden," he confirmed. "You can sit there if you want. The Velmoss doesn't mind." She considered this. Then she looked down at her hands and said very seriously, "It is very soft." "It is," he agreed. "Do you want to help?" She stayed for 3 hours. He hadn't planned to let her stay for 3 hours. He hadn't planned anything, because he hadn't expected a child to appear in his garden at all. But 3 hours was what happened when you handed a small Hethori girl a trowel the right size for her hands. He found one in the bottom of the tool crate that he'd never used because it was too small for his grip, and showed her how the Velmoss liked to be cleared around its edges. She was methodical about it, in the way of small children who have discovered a task they find genuinely interesting. She cleared the edges, patted the cleared soil, inspected the results, and then looked at him for confirmation that she had done it correctly. When he said she had, she moved on to the next section with the focused satisfaction of someone completing a survey. She asked questions, too, a steady stream of them in a mixture of Hethori and, increasingly, tentative basic, as she seemed to be using the afternoon as a language lesson as much as a gardening session. She asked what the crate planters grew. She asked why the trellis was bent like that. He explained that he'd bent the rebar himself, which she found remarkable. She asked him to demonstrate on a small piece of scrap wire, and watched his hands with the same careful attention she'd given the Velmoss. She asked if the garrison smelled different to him than it did to her, which was such a genuinely interesting question that he sat with it for a moment before answering honestly that he didn't know, because he'd never smelled it from the outside. She laughed at that, a small, bright sound, and said that it smelled like the tool room in the transit station, which was clearly meant as description, and which he filed away to think about later. At some point he realized he was enjoying himself considerably. He wasn't, on the whole, someone who spent much time with children. He had a nephew back home whom he saw at intermittent holidays, and who was currently 12 and interested only in a particular game that Reed could not follow. He had no strong feelings about children one way or another. They were people who had not yet become their full selves, and he found them reasonable to deal with when they appeared in his vicinity. But Sevri was specifically good company, curious, self-possessed, funny in a dry way that seemed to run against her age, and absolutely certain of her own opinions about which section of the Velmoss bed needed the most attention and why. At 1400, he had to stop for the perimeter check. He told her this, and she accepted it without complaint, handing back the small trowel with the gravity of someone returning borrowed equipment. "Tomorrow?" she asked. "I'll be here tomorrow morning," he said. "Same time." She nodded, with the expression of someone making a mental note. Then she went back through the gap in the wall, the paneling scraping quietly behind her, and was gone. Reed stood in his garden for a moment looking at the Velmoss beds, which were the most neatly edged they had been in months. Then he went to his perimeter check. He did not, that afternoon, think to wonder very hard about where she had come from, or who she belonged to, or why a small Hethori child was squeezing through gaps in garrison walls to investigate gardens. He assumed, vaguely, that she lived somewhere nearby. There was a civil district 2 streets east of the garrison perimeter, and that she had come through the gap for the same reason children came through gaps everywhere, because it was there. He was correct about the last part. Part 2. What Reed learned about the garden and about Sevri over the following weeks. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that. By the end of the first week, he had assembled the following facts. Her full name was Sevrilyn, and Sevri was what people called her who knew her well. She had granted him this from the beginning without explanation, which he only later understood was a significant thing in Hathori custom. She was 5 years old, 6 at the autumn equinox, which she mentioned with the weighty significance of someone counting down to something important. She lived in a residence she described as the tall building behind the water fountain, and declined to specify further, which he attributed to the natural vagueness of children about addresses. She had a mother whom she clearly adored and who was, she said, very busy right now, delivered with the resigned acceptance of a child who understood this and did not hold it against her. She had an attendant named Rissa who was sometimes responsible for her in the mornings, and Rissa's great flaw was that she fell asleep while reading. He understood from this that Sevri was sneaking out. He sat with that for a day, trying to decide if it was his problem. He decided it was partly, and so he asked her directly, did Rissa know where she was? Sevri considered the question with the precision she brought to everything. Rissa knows I go out, she said, with the particular care of a child who has thought carefully about the exact truth. She does not know where. Does your mother know? A pause, during which Sevri became very interested in a section of trellis wire. My mother is working, she said. He understood that the answer to that question was no. He spent another day deciding what to do about this. The garrison was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the safest locations in the Hethysvor district. The eastern annex wall backed onto a civil street that was quiet in the mornings and well-maintained. The gap in the wall was low enough and small enough that nothing dangerous was getting through it. Sevri herself was perfectly safe. The risk to her was not physical. The risk was that a 5-year-old child was going somewhere her mother didn't know about, and that her mother didn't know. He settled on a compromise. He told Sevri that he wouldn't tell Rissa or her mother as long as she agreed to 2 things. First, that she came every morning at the same time, so that he would know if she didn't appear, and second, that she told him if anything happened on the way. She accepted these terms with the seriousness of a treaty negotiation and extended her hand to be pressed, which was the Hathori way of sealing an agreement of significant weight. He pressed her hand. She nodded once precisely, and that was that. She also, from that conversation, began telling him considerably more about herself, as if the acknowledgement that he knew about the situation and had chosen to be responsible about it had upgraded him to a different category of person. He had noticed this dynamic before in the garrison and out of it, that people of any species told you more once they knew you had taken them seriously, children especially. He learned that her mother worked very long hours and came home late most evenings. He learned that Sevri found the residence lonely because there were no other children there. He learned that she found Rissa kind but boring, not unkindly said, just the honest assessment of someone who required a particular kind of company that Rissa did not provide. He learned that she had strong opinions about the Hathori game of Veth Cow, which was played with small weighted discs on a chalk grid, and that she could beat most of the adults in the residence at it, which she said they found embarrassing. She did not find it embarrassing. She found it clarifying about how adults often failed to think 3 moves ahead because they were too attached to their early positions. He learned that she liked plants because her mother had a small collection of them in the residence and had taught her how to water them, and that this was why she had come through the gap in the first place. She had seen the garden from the outside and been unable to not investigate. She had, she told him, measured the gap with a piece of scrap wire she found near the annex before deciding it was safe to enter. He asked her what the measurement told her. She explained that if the gap was 60 centimeters wide and 40 tall, then no adult Hathori could follow her through it, and even if Rissa woke up, there was no immediate consequence. He sat with the logic of this for a moment, which was genuinely impeccable. You planned it, he said. I planned the entry and the contingency, she said. I didn't plan to find you. That was unexpected. Was it a good unexpected? She looked at the Velmos beds. Yes, she said. "The garden is better than I expected from outside." He wasn't sure he'd received a better compliment in 14 months of posting. In return for what she told him, he told her about himself, his posting, how long he'd been in Hethai's Vor, where he was from, the nephew who liked the game he couldn't follow. She was a good listener. She asked follow-up questions that were often sharper than he expected. When he mentioned that he'd been in the garrison long enough to submit 14 perimeter check reports, she asked him what the reports documented and whether anyone read them. He said he believed they did, but he didn't know for certain. She made the expression she made when she thought something was poorly organized and said that reports should always have a confirmation receipt. He told her she was right. She was interested in everything about the garrison, its layout, its structure, the organization of the duty roster, why some buildings were older than others. She retained everything he told her and produced it in later conversations with the easy accuracy of someone building a working mental model of a place. When he pointed out, one morning, that the planter near the barracks wall would get better light if moved 6 centimeters left, she told him that she had already calculated this 2 days ago and had been waiting to see if he noticed. He moved the planter. She approved. By the end of the 3rd week, Corporal Addisa Fenmore, his second, and the person in the garrison who most reliably shared the morning hours in the garden with him, had noticed the small Hethori girl who appeared every morning and asked, with admirable directness, who she was. "A neighbor," Reed said. Fenmore looked at him. "A neighbor who is 5. 6 in autumn," Reed said. "She's very clear about it." Fenmore looked at the Velmoss beds, which were now edged with a precision that he had never achieved on his own, and said nothing. He sat down on the low wall and accepted the mug of tea that Reed offered him, and within 3 minutes Severi had explained to him, in careful basic, that the trellis wire would hold better if the horizontal runs were spaced 18 centimeters apart rather than 20, and that she had tested this with a piece of scrap wire she had found near the supply annex. Fenmore, who had an engineering background and had spent 8 years thinking about load-bearing structures, looked at the trellis and then at the child who had diagnosed its problem in her 3rd week of existence and said, slowly, "She's right." "I know," Reed said. Fenmore helped her redesign the trellis that morning. They debated the optimal attachment points for a full hour, Severi on her knees in the Velmoss with the scrap wire demonstrating her proposals, Fenmore sitting beside her with his hands folded, asking questions that she answered with increasing confidence and occasional corrections. When they arrived at the solution she pronounced correct, she pressed his hand in the Hethori confirmation gesture, which he returned without being asked, and which seemed to please her greatly. By the end of the 4th week, 2 other members of the garrison had discovered Severi, one through the garden, one because she had been sitting on the supply annex steps eating the small fruit roll she brought every morning, and had struck up a conversation with a passing private who had nothing to do with the garden whatsoever. She had explained Veth Cal to him in considerable detail. He had found a chalk grid in the rec room. They had played 3 games, which she had won. He had asked her, afterward, if she always won. She had said that she did not always win, but that she worked to understand why she had lost, which was more useful than winning without understanding. He had looked at her for a long moment, and then told her she was terrifying, in a tone of sincere admiration. She had considered this and said, "Thank you." There was, in the garrison, no formal record of Severi. Her visits were not logged, not reported, not part of any official arrangement. She arrived each morning and she left before the duty change at midday, and this was simply how things were. The garrison, which was full of people who had become accustomed to the rhythms of a particular posting and valued those rhythms, absorbed her the way it absorbed any persistent and harmless irregularity, by building around it. The morning the Queen came, Severi was teaching Reed the 2nd-tier strategy of Veth Cal. They had laid out the chalk grid on a flat section of paving near the Velmoss beds. Severi had produced a folded paper grid from somewhere about her person that he suspected she carried specifically for this purpose, and the weighted discs, also produced from her pockets, where she apparently stored entire systems, were arranged in the mid-game pattern she was demonstrating. She was explaining, with some exasperation at his choices, why his instinct to advance the outer ring early was strategically short-sighted. "The disk you moved 3 turns ago," she said, pointing. "I was controlling the center. You were giving up your outer flexibility for center control you didn't need yet. I needed center control." She looked at him with the expression she used when he said something she found particularly misguided. "You did not need center control on turn 3. You needed information about where I was moving. The outer ring gives you information. Center control uses the information you already have." He looked at the board. He could see in retrospect that she was right. "When did you figure that out?" he asked. "When I was 4, she said. "My mother showed me." He thought about this, about a queen sitting across a Vethkal board from a 4-year-old, explaining outer ring theory. The image was unexpectedly vivid and unexpectedly warm. "Move," she said. He moved a disk. She looked at it. She moved a single disk, 3 squares to the left. His position collapsed in a way he was only just beginning to understand, which meant she had planned it several moves earlier. He looked at the board. "How?" he said. "Outer ring," she said, in a very small, very satisfied voice. He was laughing when the gate opened. Part 3, the Queen at the Gate. He heard it before he saw it, the garrison's eastern service gate, which opened directly onto the narrow alley behind the annex, swinging wide on its hinges. He looked up. She was standing in the gateway. The first thing he registered was the escort. 4 Hethari in the formal gray and copper of palace security, 2 flanking the gateway and 2 behind, positioned with the efficiency of people who had been doing this for several hours and had not stopped being precise about it. The second thing he registered was that the woman in the center of them was not in formal dress. She was wearing working clothes, close-fitted in dark blue, with the slightly travel-worn quality of someone who had been moving fast through the city for some time and had not stopped. Her copper hair was not braided. It fell loose around her face and shoulders in the manner he knew from 14 months of careful observation meant something formal and authoritative in the Hethori context, the deliberate absence of rank marking as a kind of rank marking in itself. The absence of the braids said, "I am not here in an administrative capacity. I am here in my own right, and you will understand that." He understood it. The third thing he registered was her face. She was scanning the courtyard, rapidly, systematically, the way soldiers scanned rooms and parents scanned playgrounds, looking for the thing and simultaneously bracing for its absence. And then she found what she was looking for. He had seen, in 14 months at this posting and in several before it, many varieties of relief. He had seen it in medical bays and in staging rooms, and once on a hillside where a search team had come back with someone they'd been told not to expect. He had come to understand that relief was not a single thing. It had textures, and the texture depended on how long the fear had run and what kind of fear it had been. He had seen it on the faces of people in medical bays, in the expressions of individuals receiving news they had feared would be different. But what he saw on this woman's face when her eyes found Sevri in the middle of the Vethkal grid, sitting cross-legged with a disc in her hand, turned away from the gate, not yet aware she was being looked at, was something that he thought did not have a word in Basic and probably had a very precise one in Hethori. It was not just relief. It was the end of the particular kind of fear that operates on high control, the kind you do not let show while it is happening because showing it will not help, but which, when it resolves, leaves its mark on a face like water leaving marks on stone. He got to his feet. Sevri heard the gate or heard him rise and turned to look. She saw her mother. Her face moved through several things in less than a second, recognition, calculation, a kind of arriving at something, and then she said very calmly, "Oh." Not frightened, Not guilty exactly, just, this was going to happen and it is happening now. The queen crossed the courtyard in 4 steps. She stopped in front of Sèvres and crouched down, bringing herself to eye level with the deliberateness of someone doing it on purpose rather than out of instinct. And for a moment she simply looked at her, at the velmoss on her hands from an earlier session, at the braids that had come loose, at the chalk dust on her knees, at the disc still held in her fingers. Her expression was doing something complicated and controlled. Then she put her hands on Sèvres' face. Her thumbs traced the line of Sèvres' cheekbones gently, and she said something in the northern dialect, low and fast, that Reed's Hethori couldn't follow. Sèvres' answer was clear. "I'm all right, mother. I was very careful." "You were gone," her mother said, in a voice that was controlled in a way that cost something. "Rissa woke and you were not there. She could not find you." "I was here," Sèvres said, patient and unruffled. "I am here every morning." "No one knew that." "You do now." A pause, during which Sèvres appeared to reconsider the tone she had chosen. She softened slightly. "I'm sorry Rissa was frightened. I didn't think she would wake so early." Her mother's breath came out in something that was almost a laugh, and was not. She pulled Sèvres against her, and Sèvres went, pressing her face against her mother's shoulder, and patting the back of her arm with a small, moss-dusty hand in the manner of someone who understands that the person holding her needs a moment, and is content to give it. Reed stood to one side and waited. One of the escort guards had moved to a position slightly behind him, not aggressive, simply placed, in the way of trained people who covered space as a habit. He understood and did not take it personally. He kept his hands visible and relaxed. After a time the queen stood. She looked at him. He met her eyes and held them. "Staff Sergeant," she said, his rank precise and correct, which meant she had been briefed in the time between the search beginning and her arrival or had done very rapid research in transit. "My name is Varathi Kessin Laurel Hethori. I am the governing queen of the Hethysvor domain." A pause measured. "This is my daughter, Severlin Laurel Nuz Hethori. She is the crown princess." He took that in. He looked down at Sèvres, who looked up at him with the expression of someone who has not exactly concealed something, and has not exactly disclosed it, and is now watching to see how the person being revealed to will respond. "I suspected she might come from a significant family," he said. The queen's expression shifted, something that was adjacent to a smile but hadn't decided yet. "What gave it away?" "The Vethkal strategy," he said. "Outer ring theory at age 5. I've played the game for 2 years and I can't beat her. I thought she'd learned from someone who was either very good or had spent a great deal of time thinking about it." Sèvres, beside her mother, made a very small sound of satisfied dignity. The queen looked down at her daughter, and then at the chalk grid still laid out on the paving, and then at the garden around them. The velmoss beds edged with precision, the redesigned trellis, the planter boxes in their careful arrangement, the 2 mugs sitting on the low wall. Her face did something he could not entirely read, but which had a quality of arriving somewhere unexpected and needing to account for it. "How long?" she said. 5 weeks, he said. "She came through a gap in the annex wall." "I measured it first," Sèvres said helpfully. "With the scrap wire, it was exactly the right size." "You measured a gap in a garrison wall," her mother said. "The 60-centimeter measurement means no adult can follow me through. That was the relevant data point." The queen looked at her daughter with an expression that traveled through several registers. The aftermath of fear, something that was almost exasperation, something that was almost pride, and arrived at the quiet, tired, rueful recognition of a parent who has raised a particular kind of child, and long since stopped being surprised by the quality of their logic, even when the context of it was alarming. "And you," she said, returning to Reed. Her voice had changed, not softened exactly, but shifted from formal assessment to something more direct. "You knew she was not from the civil district." "I suspected after the 2nd week," he said. Some details didn't match. The residence she described, the fact that she knows outer ring theory and speaks formal basic as a second language, the way she talks about her mother's schedule. And you did not report it. She was safe, he said. The garrison is a controlled environment. I verified her arrival and departure every morning and made sure she was accounted for during the hours she was here. If she had been in any danger, or if she had missed a morning without explanation, I would have escalated immediately. You made a unilateral decision about a child who you suspected was from a significant family. He held this. Yes, I did. I made it because she was safe and because she was here every morning and because reporting it would have ended something that was, as far as I could observe, doing her no harm. I take full responsibility for that decision. A silence. The guard behind him had not moved. Scifi, who had been tracking this exchange with the close attention she brought to everything worth paying attention to, said, "He checked every day, Mother. He told me that if I missed a morning without telling him, he would ask about me." "I know," the Queen said, in a quieter voice. Something in it had shifted further away from formal assessment toward something else. I could see the arrangement from the moment I walked in. She was still looking at the garden. The morning light was on the Velmoss beds, the blue-gray of them a calm and precise color against the pale stone of the annex wall. Fenmore had straightened the trellis last week, and it was, Reed had to admit, considerably better than what he'd built on his own. Scifi's edging work was visible from here, the clean line around each bed, maintained with the regularity of something she cared about. The Queen said, "She has talked about plants every evening for 5 weeks. She said it not to him and not to Scifi but to the garden, in the tone of someone reporting something out loud that they had been assembling privately. I thought she was talking about the residence collection. I did not think to ask." "I'm sorry you were frightened," he said. She looked at him. The amber-orange of her eyes was the same shade as Scifi's, but older, the same clear quality run through with something more layered. "Are you?" "Yes," he said. "I've been on postings where children went missing. I know what that search looks like. I'm sorry you had to run it." A long moment. "Your name," she said. "Callum Reed." "Yes." "Staff Sergeant, 3rd Human Contingent, HFY Stories posting." "Yes." She looked at him for another moment, and then she looked at the Velmoss beds, and then she looked at her daughter, who was waiting with her disc still in her hand, and an expression of someone who is staying quiet because she can read a room. "We'll discuss the arrangement," the Queen said. She offered nothing more definitive than that. Then she put her hand on Scifi's shoulder and began to move toward the gate. Scifi let herself be guided for 2 steps and then turned back. "Cal." He looked at her. "Outer ring," she said. "You had the right position before you advanced. You just didn't wait." "I know," he said. "I'll show you the full sequence tomorrow." She said it with complete confidence, the declarative tone of someone setting an appointment, and then she walked through the gate with her mother and was gone. Part 4, the communique and what followed. He expected when she left that would be the end of it. He had made a unilateral decision about the whereabouts of the Crown Princess for 5 weeks. He had not reported her presence. He had, by any standard reading of diplomatic protocol, created a situation that could have developed into something serious, and had instead developed into a fairly extensive Vethkal education and a redesigned trellis. But those were not the metrics that formal protocol used, and he knew it. He wrote a full account that afternoon and filed it with Captain Nesbitt, who read it twice, said nothing for a long time, and then said, "Reed, this is either going to be completely fine or extremely not fine, and I have no idea which." "Yes, sir," Reed said. "How good is she at Vethkal?" "Better than anyone in the garrison." Nesbitt was quiet for another moment. "Go," he said. "I'll handle the formal response." The formal communique arrived the following morning. It was addressed to Staff Sergeant Callum Reed, Human Contingent, Hethys Vor Garrison, in the careful formal Hethari used for official correspondence. The Queen's cipher was at the bottom, an interlocking triple spiral that he recognized from the official communiques the garrison received, though it had never appeared on anything addressed to him personally before. He opened it and read it twice. It said, in the formal, precise language of official Hethori communication, that the garrison was informed that the Crown Princess's morning visits to the garrison garden would henceforth be conducted with the knowledge and approval of the Queen, under the following conditions: that the visiting hours remained consistent with the existing arrangement, that a member of the palace security staff would be present at the service gate at all times during visits, that the Crown Princess's attendant would accompany her to and from the gate, and that the garrison was authorized to continue the existing arrangement, including the Vethkal instruction, as a matter of cultural exchange between the human contingent and the domain's royal house. At the bottom, below the cipher, in handwriting rather than formal script, a different pen pressed more lightly into the paper, as if added after the formal draft was complete. "She trusts you, thank you." He read it 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his field journal, which was where he put things he intended to keep track of. Sevri came back the following morning, and the morning after that, and continued to come every morning for the remainder of Reed's posting. She brought Rissa with her, a small, quiet Hethori woman who sat on the low wall and read while Sevri gardened, and who after the first week began bringing her own tea, and who turned out to have extensive opinions about the spacing of ground-level beds, expressed with unexpected vigor and correctness. She also had opinions about Fenmore's redesigned trellis, all of which he listened to with the focused attention of a person receiving useful technical input, which was what it was. A palace security officer arrived at the gate each morning precisely 3 minutes before Sevri and took a position at the alley end. He was a compact, efficient Hethori man named Burith who declined offers of tea for the first week, and then accepted one in the second, and from the 3rd week onward appeared to consider it part of his assignment brief. He did not garden. He watched Sevri with the contained alertness of someone performing a duty they took seriously, and when she won a Vethkal game, which she did with regularity, he made no expression at all, which Reed suspected concealed something in the vicinity of satisfaction. The Queen came 3 weeks after the formal arrangement was put in place. She arrived without formal announcement, in the same working clothes, with 2 rather than 4 escort members. A smaller footprint, Reed thought, less deliberate than her first visit. He was in the annex reviewing the perimeter check log when he heard the gate, and came out to find her standing at the edge of the courtyard, watching Sevri instruct Fenmore in an advanced Vethkal position, with the patience of someone who has explained a thing 12 times, and is on the 13th. He waited to see if she wanted to be noticed. She looked at him after a moment and accepted the silent offer of the low wall. He went inside and came back with 2 mugs of tea. She took hers without comment and held it in both hands and watched Sevri for a while. "She comes home talking about the drainage," she said eventually. "The eastern bed," he said. "The angle of the sun in this part of the courtyard pulls the moisture out faster than I planned for. We've been working on a shade structure." She drew diagrams. He thought about this, about a child bringing home diagrams of drainage solutions. "Did she show you?" "She explained them to me." The Queen's voice had the warmth of someone describing something they found unexpectedly moving. She said the problem was that the bed placement didn't account for the seasonal sun angle, and that the solution was either to move the bed or build a shade structure, and that moving the bed was simpler but the shade structure would be more durable, and that the material question was whether the annex had scrap rebar to spare. "It does," he said. Fenmore checked. "I know, she told me." A pause. "She's been explaining things to me every evening, the Velmoss's care requirements, the trellis design, The optimal disk weight for Vethkal at altitude. The garrison's daily schedule. He thought about what it might be like to hear the garrison's daily schedule delivered in the analytical register of a 5-year-old who had been paying close attention for 6 weeks. "I hope that's not a security concern," he said. The Queen looked at him with a glimmer of something. "She is 5. The strategic value of knowing when the third watch changes is not something I am currently worried about." He accepted this. "She was very lonely," the Queen said more quietly. "Before this, I didn't know how much. I work long hours and I thought the residence was enough. Rissa is kind, the collection of books is good, she has Vethkal." A pause. "I didn't see that she needed people to do things with." He didn't answer immediately. There was a specific quality of confession in what she'd said, not guilt-ridden, not seeking absolution, but the honest accounting of someone taking stock. "She finds people more interesting than most people realize," he said. "She watches how they work, what they pay attention to. She wanted to know if the garrison smelled different to me than it did to her on her first morning. I told her I didn't know because I'd never been outside it." The Queen was quiet for a moment. "What did she say?" "That it smelled like the tool room in the transit station." She meant it as useful information. The Queen made the sound that was almost a laugh, and this time it got a little further before she controlled it. She watched Sevri explain something to Fenmore with an extended piece of scrap wire, both of them kneeling on the paving, and her face was the face of someone seeing a thing clearly that they have been looking at for a while. "Her father was the same," she said. "He needed to be around people who were doing something. He found stillness difficult. I should have known she would take after him in this." He did not ask about the father. The Queen's voice when she spoke of him had the quality of something set down with care, and he understood it was offered for acknowledgement, not inquiry. "She's very good with Fenmore," he said. "He has an engineering background. They communicate well. Fenmore is the one with the trellis opinions. And the tea. He makes the best tea in the garrison. She told him so on the 3rd day, and he's made it every morning since." The Queen finished her mug and set it on the wall. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The garrison's perimeter reports. Your name is on 14 of them." He was slightly surprised. "Yes. I've been reviewing the district infrastructure files." She said it without emphasis, the way she said most things plainly, without decoration. The reports were thorough. The conditions they documented were accurate. Some of them had been in a deferred list for 6 months. He thought about the 14 reports, which he had filed into a system he believed was probably read and probably acted upon, without certainty of either. "I'm glad they were useful. The reconstruction planning for the civil annex sector is using them as the baseline assessment." She stood. "I wanted you to know." He watched her cross toward the gate. At the gate she paused. "Callum." The use of his given name in the formal Hethori context had a weight to it, a register shift, a thing offered. "Yes." She looked back. For a moment her face was something other than governing. It was the face that appeared when she watched Sevri and forgot to hold it back. Warm, rueful, genuinely fond, slightly alarmed in the way of parents who know their children well. Next week she intends to learn to bend wire properly. She mentioned it last evening as though it were a scheduled appointment. A pause. "I would like to know what she plans to build with it before she begins." He thought about the scrap wire, the measured gap, the redesigned trellis, the diagrams she had taken home. "Honestly," he said, "I'm curious too." The Queen's expression cracked, a real smile, brief and full and unguarded, the morning light in it, and she shook her head and went through the gate, and the escort closed around her and she was gone. He stood in the garden for a long moment after she left, in the particular quiet that follows something. Then Sevri said from behind him, "You didn't tell her what I'm building." He turned. She was standing in the Velmoss beds with a wire in her hand, and the expression of someone conducting a review. "I don't know what you're building," he said. "I know," she looked at the wire. "I haven't decided yet. I wanted the skill first." He sat down on the low wall. "What are the options?" She settled beside him and began listing them, with the calm precision of someone who has been doing research. He listened, and the morning moved around them, and the Velmos caught the light the way it always did. Part 5, the last morning. His posting ended in early autumn, 3 days before Sevri's 6th birthday, which she pointed out to him with considerable precision, and which she clearly considered a logistical injustice. 3 days, she said, if you left 3 days later. "I don't set the posting schedule," he said. "I know," she was quiet for a moment, "but it is a very poor piece of scheduling." He did not disagree. He had known it was coming. The paperwork had arrived 6 weeks before. He had filed his handover documents, briefed his replacement, a young lance corporal named Sodo who had listened to the garrison briefing with admirable attention, and had then looked at the garden and the chalk grid on the paving and said, carefully, "Is all of this in the handover document?" And done what he always did at the end of a posting, which was to inventory what he was leaving and what he was taking, and to try not to make it more than it was. He was leaving the garden. It would stay. He had written a maintenance document for it, a careful, thorough 2-page guide to the Velmos beds, the trellis tension, the drainage issue near the eastern wall, the planter soil mix, the seasonal watering adjustments, and which tools were which and who in the garrison could be consulted for which problems. Rissa had read a draft of it and suggested 3 additions, all of which he incorporated. He had left the document on the workbench with the small trowel that was the right size for a child's hands. Sodo, to his credit, had read it twice. The morning before he shipped out, Sevri arrived at the service gate not at the usual time but an hour earlier. Rissa, beside her, had the look of someone who had been persuaded into an early departure by a force of nature and had accepted the situation with equanimity. Burrith was already at the gate, which Reed suspected meant he had been told and had arrived early of his own accord. Reed was already in the garden. Sevri walked in without ceremony and stood in the middle of the Velmos beds, which she had kept to a standard of precision that he had never quite managed on his own, and looked at the garden in the particular way she had of looking at things she was committing to memory, not nostalgic, just thorough. He said nothing. He let her look. After a while she moved through the beds, checking the edges, pressing a finger into the soil at the eastern corner, adjusting a piece of trellis wire that was fractionally out of position, not performing for him, just doing what she did. "The eastern bed will need more water than Sodo expects," she said. "I put that in the document. The trellis horizontal runs are good now. Don't let anyone change them." "In the document. And the Velmos doesn't like direct afternoon sun past midsummer. It recovers, but it looks bad for a week." "In the document." She turned to face him with the expression of someone who has completed a cross-check and found the results acceptable. "Okay," she said. "Then I don't want you to go." He sat down on the low wall. "I know," he said. She sat down beside him. For a while they were quiet. The morning was the pale gold of early autumn, the particular quality of light that this part of Hethysvor had in the season when the heat had broken, and the air was clear, and the Velmos had that look of something that belonged to an older world than either of them. "Will you write?" she asked. "If your mother agrees to it." "She will," she said, with the certainty of someone who has already done the assessment. Then, with the sidelong glance of someone who is deciding how much to say, "She likes you." He did not answer this. Sevri looked at him with an expression that was 5 years old and considerably older than 5 at the same time, and apparently decided that what she had said was enough. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small parcel, flat, square, wrapped in the quartermaster's brown supply paper. She took it and unwrapped it with the careful precision she brought to everything. Inside were 6 Vethcal discs, not the ones from her pockets, but new ones, made from the copper alloy material the garrison used for identification tags. He had cut them himself, on the metalworking equipment in the maintenance bay, and had spent 2 evenings getting the weight right. He'd measured her original discs with the caliper from the maintenance kit and worked from the measurements. She held them in her palm and looked at them for a long time. "They're the right weight," she said. "I measured," he said. She closed her fingers around them. Then, without ceremony, she leaned sideways and pressed her face briefly against his arm. A quick, firm, utterly characteristic gesture, nothing extended about it, just a thing she had decided to do, and then straightened up and held herself very correctly upright, the way she did when she was managing something she felt. "Come back and visit," she said. "If I'm ever back in the sector," he said. She nodded. She tucked the discs carefully into her coat pocket, alongside the scrap wire and the folded paper grid and whatever else she carried in there, and walked to the gate. Rissa was waiting. Burrith was waiting. The morning alley behind the gate was quiet. At the gate she paused and looked back. "Outer ring, Cal," she said. He laughed. "I know. You advanced too early. I'll practice." She gave him the small, composed, entirely satisfied look that he associated most strongly with her, the one she wore when something had been correctly understood, and then she went through the gate, and it closed behind her, and she was gone. He sat in the garden for a while after that in the early autumn light. The garrison was waking around him, sounds of a day beginning, of people moving and calling and doing the ordinary work of a place that continued regardless of who came and went. The Velmoss was the same as always, blue-gray and soft, the smell of iron and rain, the clean edges that Severi had kept better than he ever had. The trellis held. Fenmore's design was the right design. He thought about what she had said, "She likes you," with the sideways look and the apparent decision that the statement was sufficient, and she was not going to elaborate. He thought about the queen at the gate, the face of someone who had run a long and controlled fear, and then found her daughter sitting in a Velmoss bed working out a Vethcal problem, entirely absorbed. He thought about the handwriting below the formal cipher. "She trusts you, thank you." 4 words, added after everything else was already set down, which meant they were the thing she had wanted to say most and had left to last. Then he picked up his trowel, checked the eastern bed one more time, slightly dry at the near edge, which was always the problem, and went to pack his kit. Coda, 3 years later. The posting at Fomalhaut Station was nothing like Hethai's Vor. It was a transit hub, for one thing, enormous, loud, constantly in motion, the kind of place where you were aware of the scale of the galaxy in the particular way that came from watching species move through a space that was built to accommodate all of them at once. He had been there 4 months. He had started a window box of something local that grew in the limited light of the outer ring quarters, and had been told 3 times that window boxes were not approved, and had been told once, by the base facilities commander, who had apparently heard about the Hethai's Vor garden through the military information network, that if the window box stayed below the sill and he maintained it in good order, it would not be noticed. He was maintaining it in excellent order. The small package arrived on a morning in what passed for spring at the station's orbital position, addressed in a careful, precise script that was instantly recognizable. Inside was a single Vethcal disc. It was made from copper alloy, heavier than the ones he'd cut, and the work on it was several orders better than his, the edge perfectly even, the face polished to a mirror quality, which meant either that someone had helped her or that she had put in the practice time to learn the skill properly, and given what he knew of her, he suspected the second. On the face, in tiny and exact characters, were his initial and the Hethori numeral for the position she had been working on in their last game. "Outer ring, 3rd advance. How would you play it?" On the back, in different handwriting, older, more measured, with the same economy he had come to associate with the way she moved through anything. She has not lost a Vethkal game in 18 months. She is also, I should tell you, the reason that the Eastern Annex reconstruction was completed 4 months ahead of schedule. She took your perimeter reports to the district planning office herself when she felt the timeline was moving too slowly, and explained the drainage implications of the deferred maintenance list to the senior planner in sufficient detail that he expedited the work. The planning office sent me a formal note. I sent her to the residence garden to water the plants and had a very quiet moment in my office. She asks about you with regularity. Bureth sends the garden reports. Your perimeter work was used across the whole district. Thank you. VKL. Below that, in the first handwriting, which had grown more confident and more hers in the 3 years since he'd last seen it. The eastern bed drainage is fixed. The trellis is still Fenmore's design. The new staff sergeant keeps the edging but not to my standard. I am working on this. Come back to Hethysvor if you can. Happy birthday to me, I'm 9. He sat at his desk in the outer ring quarters of Fomalhaut Station and held the disc for a long time. He thought about a child sitting in the Velmoss with a trowel that was the right size for her hands. He thought about the measured gap and the scrap wire, and the outer ring theory explained with exasperation to a grown man who advanced too early. He thought about the queen at the gate, her face when she saw her daughter, and the fear that resolved into something he didn't have a word for. He thought about she trusts you, thank you in handwriting below a formal cipher. He thought about a 9-year-old taking perimeter reports to a district planning office and explaining drainage implications until the timeline moved faster. He got out a piece of paper, proper paper, not a message pad. Some correspondence deserved the distinction, and he wrote, "Third advance, outer ring, hold the position. Don't push the center. Wait for her to commit the inner ring, and then you have 2 lines of response she can't both cover. She'll come to you if you let her. Happy birthday, Severi. I'm sorry I missed it by 3 days. Tell the new staff sergeant the eastern bed needs the extra watering in high season. It's in the document." He paused, then below that. "Tell your mother that the district planning office story made me laugh for a long time, and that I hope the planning office recovered." He sealed it, posted it, and set the disc on the windowsill beside the window box, where the light hit it differently at different times of day. He checked the soil in the box, slightly dry at the edges, which was the problem with the outer ring quarters, and adjusted the watering and went on with the day. The Velmoss was still growing somewhere in the morning light. He was certain of that. And somewhere in Hethysvor, a girl who was 9 today and who advanced the outer ring correctly, and who had once explained drainage implications to a senior planner with sufficient thoroughness to move a construction timeline. Somewhere she was probably, at this moment, either edging the Velmoss beds or teaching someone the Vethkal second-tier strategy, or doing both at once and managing both to her standard. He thought that was probably enough. He got on with the day.